It's a pleasure talking with you today. I'll just wait for the first slide. My presentation today is media over medicine, and an important question to ask here is, was our COVID response based on clinical virology or behavioral psychology? A very important question to ask. Next slide. Some more important questions rotate around, does media have the power to make our decisions for us? Can group pressure, our fear of the crowd, force us to make illogical decisions? Was the public exposed to any group pressure psychology during the COVID response? Next slide. The next slide was a video exposing the power of group pressure. It was called the ASH Group Conformity Experiment. The video was supposed to demonstrate this experiment to you, and I'm going to have to do it live right now because I have no video. It rotated around this particular piece of paper. I'm going to do it with Dr. Stephen Malthouse. Stephen, there's a line on the right, and you have to match it the same length to one of the three lines. What's the right answer, A, B, or C? A. A, you're correct. And it was done in research groups of 6, but there were 5 actors who were instructed to give the wrong answer, to see if giving the wrong answer would pressure the research subject to give the wrong answer. Next slide. And the results were dramatic. 50% of people conformed to the crowd and gave the wrong answer. Secret answers given on paper reduced the conformity to only 12%. Only 25% of people held their ground to what they knew was true, right, and just like the honorable members here today that stood their ground. Most conformists willingly admitted that their answers were wrong, but they went along with the crowd anyway. And how much of that have we seen since March 2020? People who are most likely to conform were low status, high need for approval types. I think we're going to the next slide. Sorry, I skipped ahead. There we go. People who were most likely to conform were low status, high need for approval types. We call them the forever children in psychology. People from cultures who honor obedience, and people who derive their self-worth by how well they obey authority. Next slide. There are other conformity factors. If a person is in fear, they conform more. The conformist portion of our nervous system is our limbic system. This is our fight or flight system that responds to fear. Fear shuts down critical thinking and increases conformist behavior. Has anybody seen any fear since March of 2020? Next slide. Psychology experts explain how to best control the public. Dr. Juice Merleau, author of the book Rape of the Mind and the Psychology of Thought Control, recounted that keeping a victim confused is the best for psychological control and manipulation of the public. Dr. Merleau also recounted that with the training of any animal, it's best to train the human animal in isolation, away from others. Did anybody notice any isolation from March 2020 forward? Merleau further recounted, after studying Korean War POWs, that mind controlling a person was best served with periods of intense attack and fear, broken up by periods of peace and favored treatment. Confusion, again, to control the public. Next slide. Edward Bernays, author of the book Propaganda and Crystallizing Public Opinion, explained that the crowd wasn't even needed physically to build the group pressure that changed the victim's mind. Sitting in a room alone and only perceiving the power of an imaginary group can indeed bring about conformity to that imaginary group. Next slide. What role does fear play in psychological control or manipulation? Well, Stockholm Syndrome was a phrase coined by psychiatrist Nils Bergerot after a 5-day bank robbery standoff in Stockholm, Sweden. Many bank tellers taken hostage became sympathetic to their captors and even romantically involved under the immense trauma, fear, and stress. Demonstrations of immense public power, sometimes by the government, can trigger a survival response of trauma bonding with the abuser and endorsing the abuser for fear of reprisal. And did we see any of this trauma bonding amongst government officials from March 2020 forward? Next slide. Was psychology used against the public during COVID? Organizations like the UK's SAGE, the Safety Advisory Group for Emergencies, and the International BIT Corporation, BIT standing for Behavioral Insights Team, admitted openly to using nudge-style psychological manipulation on the public during COVID in order to achieve their desired outcomes. We were isolated and trained effectively in that isolation, as Dr. Malou described. Fear was upregulated into the stratosphere in order to lower IQ and increase conformist behaviors inside the limbic system via the fear response. Next slide. When the human animals, us, were getting trained in COVID isolation, the opinion of the perceived crowd was repetitively imprinted into us by the media, thus leading to behavior and belief-altering group compliance, as Ash had demonstrated, but without the group being physically present, as Bernays had cited. The public were kept in perpetual states of confusion with contradictory messages. We all know those contradictory messages. Gyms had to close during a health crisis, but the bottle shops were open. At first, no masks were necessary. Then one, and then two, and then no mask if you took the vaccination, and then masks back on for everybody, regardless of vaccination status. Then all of a sudden, masks didn't matter. The virus had a pocket watch. It would attack at 10 and not 9:59 during the curfews. And it had a tape measure at the restaurants, the virus did. It would attack you if you were standing, going to the bathroom, and it would not attack you if you were sitting. And that poses the question of what happens to someone if they enter a restaurant in a wheelchair. And if you are confused, you were meant to be confused, because confusion is the base of all effective mind control, brainwashing, and behavior modification. Next slide. Then came the public exposure, very important, of people's vaccine status with the work mandates triggering ASH's 50% or higher compliance to group pressure compared to the 12% compliance level if our decisions were kept to ourselves. They exposed your vaccine status knowing of the ASH conformity experiment, knowing you would comply more. That's why they did it. The cycling of terror and more normal periods of peace and favored treatment were relentless, which kept the human psyche in a permanent state of instability, optimal for controlling the masses, according to Dr. Juice Merleau. Next slide. Were authorities instructed to be heavy-handed with the public in order to trigger this trauma bonding with authority? Were they instructed to do this to facilitate Stockholm Syndrome and increase compliance? This is Canadian pastor Artur Pawlowski getting arrested multiple times for feeding the poor against COVID restriction policy. Next slide. So the question is, again, was our COVID response based on and driven by clinical virology or behavioral psychology? Crimes were committed here. You cannot weaponize psychology against the public. Criminal charges needs to be laid. Thank you very much. My name is Jason Christoff.